Hello, everyone. This is Lisa McClendon. This week in multimedia editing, we're going to talk about watching for bias in the news. And this is where you really want to listen to that little voice in your head, and that voice that tells you, is this okay? Listen to that voice. If you're even thinking it, you probably need to think about that a little bit more. Is this okay? Do a little bit of research. Think about who might be offended. Maybe you're not, but maybe somebody else might be. And remember that your audience is a lot broader than your peer group. If you're still not sure, ask other people in the newsroom. That's what colleagues are for. Bounce off some questions for them. Say, hey, do you think people could read this the wrong way? Do you think people are going to think this is insulting or offensive somehow? And talk about it. And sometimes it's not a really clear-cut thing, and that's okay, but have the discussion. That is the most important part of that. Okay, when you're talking about fairness, obviously, we all want our stories to be fair. One big red flag that you should look for is a one-source story. It's just bad journalism no matter what, but it can lend to really one-sided stories. Is there a reason that you only have one source? I guess if you're doing a Q&A with a single person, obviously you only have one source, but anywhere else, even in like a personal profile or something, having more than one source is a good idea. Another exception to that would be maybe a real quick hit breaking news kind of story when you've got a police spokesperson talking about a car accident. Okay, maybe at the very beginning of that, you're only going to have what the police tell you about it. And because if you weren't there, that's okay. Also, think about, are all sides of the story represented? And notice I said all sides and not both sides, because a lot of stories have more than two sides. A lot of people want to frame it as, this versus that, kind of a sports metaphor almost, Democrats versus Republicans and all this kind of stuff. Remember that there's generally people who are affected by whatever's going on that people are arguing about, and they need to be represented in a story too. And all the sides of the story need to be accurately represented. Make sure that there's not loaded language calling people radicals or militants. You also want to make sure that a small faction or a non-representative faction does not get a disproportionate voice in the story. And a good example of that is the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, the ones who picket funerals and have signs with lots of swear words on them. You don't want to hold them up as representing all of Christianity because they're really a very small group, and they're really pretty much a fringe faction of Christianity. And so you can't, say, well, here's a Christian group who does this, therefore all Christians are like this. Most people aren't going to say it quite so explicitly, but you don't want to treat them as like representative of a whole group. So some questions that you want to ask when you're editing a story is, have the important parties been contacted? Have we tried to? And this is why you get the line in a lot of stories that say so-and-so could not be reached for comment. And you may think, well, that's sort of a dumb thing to put in there if we didn't get any comment from him. But what it says to your audience is, we know we needed to talk to this person and we tried. Now, we didn't get any comment from them because they didn't return our phone calls or whatever, but we tried to talk to them for you so that you would have their point of view in this story. So don't cut that part of a story out, leave it in there. Is the issue that the story's dealing with, is it clearly explained? Is it objectively explained? Is it explained from a straightforward, just the facts kind of perspective? Is it fair to everybody who's involved? Now, fair means, is it accurate? Is it not painting somebody in a one-sided or incorrectly unfortunate light? And that means, if somebody is convicted of multiple murders, then fair to all involved is calling this guy a convicted murderer because he is. So it doesn't mean glossing over negative things if they are true, but they need to be accurately presented in context. And make sure you have relevant background material in there too. If somebody really needs to understand, sort of a little bit of history of an issue to figure out what the day's story means in it, make sure that's in there too. Obviously, you want to avoid racist coverage. Nobody wants to be racist. That's a good thing. But sometimes stuff creeps in anyway, despite people's stated intentions. And editors, a lot of times, are going to be the ones who miss stuff that other people see, or maybe some people just think is funny or a joke, that ends up being really offensive and is going to get you in a lot of trouble. And this is, the day of you screw this up and you are all over Twitter. So be really careful about both stories and headlines, tweets, etc., things like that. Okay, here's a couple of examples for you. This was somebody calling out Publishers Weekly because they were doing a profile of the author Jessica Kim, but they put a picture here of a different person, also happened to be Jessica Kim, but not the author Jessica Kim. And basically, sort of treating people as interchangeable is not a good thing. And that's just basic fact checking here. Just make sure, if this person is an author, then their publisher has a picture of them. Get it from them instead of just Googling and swiping a picture off the internet. This is one about the movie The Lone Ranger, that Native Americans were upset about Johnny Depp's portrayal of Tonto in there, and this story was ostensibly about that, but they managed to, in the headline and in the lead, get 3 Native American stereotypes here. And I'm sure they thought they were being cute, but it ended up being really, really offensive. So, be careful for stuff like that, and just don't. Just don't do that. It isn't funny. It isn't cute. It's going to get you in a bunch of trouble with your audience. This is from the 2016 Olympics, and there was a Chinese swimmer who was doing well and getting a lot of attention. Oh, but they had to creep in a racist stereotype. No, or not a stereotype, just a racist phrase there. Don't do that. And another one. Here's the phrase. And this phrase dates back to medieval English, and it's on its face is not an offensive phrase. The chink in the armor is basically that gap in between the plates on a suit of armor where you can, stick a sword and hurt someone. It's your vulnerability. Okay, it's a weakness. So that usage of it is fine unless you are talking about Xi Jinping or you are talking about Jeremy Lin. Because that word also is a slur, and you don't want to use it in context with anybody that is Chinese or has Chinese heritage. There's actually a really interesting story behind this ESPN headline, and there's a link to it right below this video here. So if you want to read a little bit more about that story, you can if you just follow that link. It's pretty interesting. Okay, so you really don't want to do anything obvious, but sometimes you have subtle bias creeping into a story. Just descriptions of people or talking about, people's race, ethnicity, gender, age, whatever. Sometimes it's relevant to the story. Sometimes it isn't. And sometimes, some old stereotypes kind of creep in. And editors are really responsible for checking that and making sure that that doesn't go through to publication or broadcast. Okay, and the question that you want to ask yourself here, would you specify this description, kind of flip it around? So if you're talking about what a woman is wearing, would you talk about that for a man? If you're talking about something in the context of race or ethnicity, would you mention that? Would you mention that the person was white? Sometimes you will, but a lot of times you won't. And so if you flip it around, and if you wouldn't mention it for one, don't mention it for the other. Okay, just leave it out if you don't need it there. And again, sometimes this is relevant. It may be relevant. If you are, say talking about a student who is lobbying KU to make more accessible entrances into Strong Hall, and it's because they use a wheelchair and are tired of having to go around to the back of the building. Yeah, that's really relevant to the story, so leave that in there. But a lot of times it isn't, especially marital and parenthood status with regards to women. This is often mentioned in stories about women and almost never mentioned in stories about men. So think about, is this actually relevant to the story? And here's an example of what I mean. We have here, this is a story about the Washington Post's sports department, and right at the time of this story, 3 years ago, all 4 of their major professional sports beats were covered by women, which is, groundbreaking. That it is relevant to this story that they are women, right? But then they had to, they named them, blah, blah, blah. And then they're like, oh, the lovely ladies in the photo above. You wouldn't say the handsome fellows in the photo above. No, you wouldn't ever talk about a male sports writer's looks in a story about that. So don't do it for women either. And interestingly enough, I'm pointing the arrow here because the byline is actually female. So interesting. This is one too. This is about a couple of Pulitzer Prize winning reporters in Philadelphia. They did a big investigative piece about corrupt cops and stuff like that. And how do they get described in a story? Both working moms and best friends. It's like, I guarantee if these were two dudes, we would never say they were both working dads and best friends. We would never say that if they were guys. So it doesn't need to be in there if they're women. We're talking about their profession. Now, if they're talking about, how did they do it while both being working mothers or raising small children or something like that, yeah, then it's relevant. But right now, we're talking about their Pulitzer Prize winning story getting made into a movie, maybe getting made into a movie. So this is really not relevant in this case. Be especially sensitive with disability, too. Mention someone's disability when it's relevant to the story, but don't make fun of physical illness or mental illness. People sort of think OCD is a big joke, and it's like, oh yeah, I really hate it when a circle is off. I must just be so OCD or ADD or something like that. People are, they sort of toss that around as kind of a joke. For people who have those conditions, this isn't funny. And it's really not good practice in journalism to make fun of that. Now, I realize this isn't journalism, but you'll see that sometimes creeping in kind of to feature stories. Oh my God, I'm so OCD about that. No, not in print. Say it to your friends if you want, but realize that can be really offensive to people who have the actual OCD. And what this comes down to is treating people as people. Instead of this amorphous, the disabled, how about people with disabilities, okay? But also be wary of euphemism. And euphemism, remember, is something that is, where you say something kind of like what it is, but you're softening it up. So you're calling somebody, physically challenged or differently abled. Most people see those as really patronizing and condescending. So just be straightforward about this, and people with disabilities, fine. But the most important thing here is to ask somebody how they want to be described. Some people who have autism want to be people who have autism, want to say she has autism. Some people want to say I am autistic. Ask them what they want. And again, only if it is relevant to the story. Only if it's relevant to the story. We've talked about this a little bit before, but if people are injured or killed, it is not a good idea to make fun of that. So, somebody probably thought this was funny, didn't see it coming because it's a psychic, ha ha ha. Yeah, except they were hit by a car and they were injured, and that really isn't funny. Here's another one. This animal cruelty is not funny. You've got something like this in here, some kind of making fun of this. Yeah. Is this funny or is this offensive? Part of this may depend on your audience. I mean, if you notice, this publication is called Florida. And it's all the weird news out of Florida. So people who are reading that may think that's funny. I would say for any kind of, sort of mainstream general audience news publication or broadcast, don't go there on that. Don't go there, because you will get a lot of nasty letters and calls, and people will be mad for no real reason. Then you just had to make a couple of jokes. And you don't want to alienate your audience over that. And so we'll end up here with, the list of things that aren't funny. Obviously death, disaster, violence. That is, any kind of violent crime, domestic violence, sexual assault, not funny. War is not funny. Nazis are not funny. I mean, unless you're covering a production of the producers. Anything serious about the Holocaust and Nazis, not time for a joke here. Slavery, not funny. Anything else that is really sort of pretty serious, you don't want to alienate your audience. You're just trying to deliver the news to people who need some information, and you don't want to make a joke that some people are going to think are not funny.